Reading the Times for Thursday, February 20th, 2020. Warren leads an onslaught of attacks, zeroing in on Bloomberg. The Democratic presidential candidates turned on one another in scorching and personal terms in a debate on Wednesday night with two of the leading candidates, Senator Bernie Sanders and Michael R. Bloomberg, forced onto the defensive repeatedly throughout the evening. Two candidates who have shied away from direct conflict in past debates, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts and former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., mounted something of a tag team onslaught against Mr. Bloomberg several times, leaving him visibly irked and straining to respond. Ms. Warren landed the most stinging blows against Mr. Bloomberg throughout the debate, starting with an opening broadside that likened him to the figure most reviled among Democrats, President Trump. Hundreds released from Diamond Princess cruise ship in Japan, even as infections aboard a cruise ship contaminated by the new coronavirus continue to climb. Japan declared on Wednesday that 443 people had satisfied the terms of a 2-week quarantine and let them walk free. The United States government came to a similar conclusion about the infection control measures when, in an apparent reversal of its early advice to passengers that they should stay isolated in their cabins to minimize the risk of infection, it decided to evacuate hundreds of its citizens on Monday. In a letter to American passengers on Sunday, the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo wrote that because of mounting infections on the Diamond Princess, the Department of Health and Human Services made an assessment that the passengers and crew members on board are at high risk of exposure. The 11 criminals granted clemency by Trump had one thing in common: connections. Mr. Safavian, who had ties to the White House, said he was putting together a letter asking President Trump to pardon Mr. Carrick, the former New York City police commissioner, who pleaded guilty to tax fraud and other charges, while 14,000 clemency petitions to sit unaddressed at the Justice Department's Office of the Pardon Attorney. Mr. Trump eagerly granted relief to a former football team owner who hosted a pre-inauguration party, a one-time contestant on Celebrity Apprentice, and an infamous investor championed both by Rudolph W. Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer, and by the billionaire who hosted a $10 million fundraiser for Mr. Trump just last weekend. Angela Stanton, an author and television personality with a record stemming from a stolen vehicle ring, was championed by Alveda King, a niece of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a Fox News contributor and outspoken Trump supporter. Ms. King appeared with Ms. Stanton at a Women for Trump Summit meeting in 2018. While most of this week's recipients had political ties, Mr. Trump's defenders pointed to 3 women whose sentences he commuted without any notable political background. Billions of targets on his back, Bloomberg joins the debate fray. Ms. Warren, seeking to boost her chances after setbacks in the first 2 states, appeared particularly emboldened, tweaking Ms. Klobuchar on healthcare policy. Mr. Sanders for the vitriol among some of his supporters, and most gleefully, Mr. Bloomberg. The inability of any candidate to unite the party's disparate factions so far has provided Mr. Bloomberg with an opening, albeit a complicated one, particularly after the disappointing early state returns for Mr. Biden, whose stumbles on the campaign trail last year helped persuade Mr. Bloomberg to reconsider a decision to stay away. The result, with voting already underway, is a field whose frontrunner, Mr. Sanders, and his would-be spoiler, Mr. Bloomberg, have both spent much of their adult lives resisting a full embrace of the party they now hope to lead. We could wake up 2 weeks away from today, the day after Super Tuesday, and the only candidates left standing would be Bernie Sanders and Mike Bloomberg, the two most polarizing figures on this stage. Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, warned, adding, "Let's put forward somebody who's actually a Democrat." California governor declares homeless crisis a disgrace. Vulnerable to the charge that the problem has exploded under Democratic rule in California, Mr. Newsom, a former mayor of San Francisco, pleaded with and at times admonished legislators to take action. Mr. Newsom said California could not wait any longer to build more housing. Mr. Newsom called homelessness a national crisis in his speech, but did not acknowledge the outsized role that California plays in the problem. A police state with an Islamist twist inside Heffner's Libya. In Mr. Heffner's Benghazi stronghold, we found a half-ruined city beset by corruption, where security agents trailed foreign journalists, residents cowered in fear of arbitrary arrest, and pro-government militias answered to no one. Mr. Heffner has served as an officer in Colonel Gaddafi's army, but later fled to the United States, where he lived for decades as a CIA client before returning to Libya during the uprising in 2011. He began his drive for power by promising to save Benghazi. Mr. Heffner authorized General Madani El-Fakhri to create a for-profit investment arm for Mr. Heffner's military. UK's new immigration rules will restrict low-skilled workers. To a chorus of complaints from employers, Britain said on Wednesday it would slam the door on low-skilled workers as it moved to cut overall immigration by locking migrants from Europe and elsewhere out of sectors like catering, construction, senior care, and hospitality. In response, the government is trying to alter the composition of the migrant workforce, tilting it toward people with greater skills. The government estimates that 70% of European Union workers currently in Britain would not have met the requirements of the new skilled worker route, and that therefore the overall number of immigrants should fall in the future. Ex-North Korean diplomat runs for South Korean parliament. A former North Korean diplomat who fled his embassy posting has become the first defector to run for South Korea's parliament, saying on Wednesday that he was motivated by Seoul's forced repatriation of two North Korean fishermen who wanted to defect to the south. South Korean Navy commandos seized the two North Koreans from their squid fishing boats in early November after they had repeatedly resisted an order to surrender, according to South Korean officials. Mr. Tai said his candidacy could be eye-opening for the members of the North Korean elite working on traveling abroad, who might watch his election campaign through their smartphones and spread the word to isolated relatives back in the north. 14 died and hundreds sickened in Pakistan, and the cause is a mystery. Some officials have attributed the illnesses and deaths to a gas leak that started Sunday evening in Kimari, a coastal neighborhood close to Karachi's main port. The province's chemical science laboratory and officials of Karachi Port Trust have blamed the illnesses and fatalities on the release of methyl bromide, which is used in the fumigation of large vessels at the port. Jamil Akhtar, the chairman of the Karachi Port Trust, told local news media outlets that the problem did not originate from the port. Coronavirus worsens US-China ties and bolsters hawks in Washington. Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South China Sea. Now a spiraling epidemic has become the latest and potentially most divisive issue driving apart the United States and China. The expulsions occurred a day after the U.S. State Department announced that it would treat China's main state news media organizations operating in the United States as arms of the Chinese government. The U.S. State Department said it had delivered 18 tons of donated medical supplies to China and announced that it was prepared to give $100 million to China and other nations. She left Wuhan to become a journalist. Now she's back in time to get the story. Without a job, Miss Liu returned to Wuhan to celebrate the Lunar New Year with her parents. Concerned about her safety, Miss Liu's parents forced her to stay home, but she found an opportunity to use her skills as a reporter anyway, carving out a role for herself as a volunteer who makes sure citizens in Wuhan have access to the information they need to manage their lives under quarantine. There is not a channel for local Wuhan people to communicate with the government so that we know what is happening, so that we know that the government is aware of what we need. New Iranian missiles pose threat to U.S. aircraft in Yemen, Pentagon says. The weapons, which the officials referred to as 358 missiles, were seized by U.S. Navy warships in two separate shipments in the Arabian Sea. In a news briefing, Captain Bill Urban, a spokesman for the U.S. Central Command, declined to comment on how the missiles worked. A military official familiar with the captured weapons described them as cruise missiles designed to avoid U.S. defensive measures that were also capable of downing American military helicopters, as well as the tilt-rotor MV-22 Osprey. Another U.S. military official confirmed to the New York Times that the 358 missiles from Iran have been fired against U.S. drones flying in Yemeni airspace, but they have not yet succeeded in hitting any of the drones. Australian police treating car fire that killed 3 children as crime scene. The 3 young children and 1 man were killed on Wednesday in a horrific car fire that was declared a crime scene by the police in the northeastern Australian city of Brisbane. The newspaper, The Australian, reported that witnesses had said that they saw a white car moving while on fire. Inspector Thompson told reporters, "It'll be a horrific thing for the police and the emergency services to deal with in the coming days." To prevent next coronavirus, stop the wildlife trade, conservationists say. Chinese citizens are angry because they've learned that wildlife traded for food that once again caused a national health crisis because a small number of wildlife traders continue to hold the entire country hostage, said Peter Lee, an associate professor of East Asian politics at the University of Houston downtown, who specializes in China's domestic policies. No one knows the full scope of wildlife trade worldwide, but the numbers are staggering, on the order of millions of animals of hundreds of species trafficked each day, according to Vincent Nijman, a wildlife trade researcher at Oxford Brookes University in England. The country's wildlife policies are based on the premise that wildlife is a natural resource to be utilized, he said, and officials tend to view nature through an economic rather than ecological lens. Oil and gas may be a far bigger climate threat than we know. The scientists were helped in their analyses by different isotopes found in methane emissions from natural sources compared to emissions from the production of fossil fuels. Robert Howarth, an Earth system scientist at Cornell University, who was not involved with the research, called it a very important study. He said it was consistent with recent research, like a study he published last year that estimated that North American gas production was responsible for about a third of the global increase in methane emissions over the past decade. Last week, the British oil giant BP set an ambitious climate change goal, saying it aimed to eliminate or offset by 2050 all planet-warming emissions from its oil and gas production, as well as emissions caused by the burning of the oil and gas it pumps from the ground. The grisly deaths of a woman and a girl shock Mexico and test its president. The overall number of women who die violently in Mexico has also increased, rising to 10 killings per day in 2019 from 7 per day in 2017, according to the Mexico office of UN Women. Women are demanding a shift of paradigm and nothing less, said Estefania Vela, executive director of Intersecta, a Mexico City-based group that promotes gender equality. Last Friday, protesters, most of them women, spray-painted "Femicide State" and "Not One More" on the facade and main doorway of the National Palace in Mexico. Family of Caroline Flack shares post written before star's suicide. Weeks before taking her own life, Caroline Flack, the British television personality, wrote that she had been suffering from an emotional breakdown for a very long time, according to an unpublished social media post made public by her family on Wednesday. Miss Flack's family shared her post with the Eastern Daily Press, a local newspaper covering Norfolk County in eastern England, where the star grew up. Chris Flack, Caroline Flack's mother, said her daughter sent her the message at the end of January and had been told by her advisors not to post it, but said she wanted her daughter's voice to be heard. West German men fill race to replace Chancellor Merkel. Coming at a time when Europe and the world are looking to Germany for renewed leadership, the choice of the next party leader is likely to have ramifications well beyond the party. Traditionally, party delegates choose their leader, but no details or timeline have been announced, and the party's delegates are not scheduled to meet until December. Any cooperation, teamwork, support, or coalition with the AfD is unacceptable for the Christian Democrats, Mr. Laschet told his party. On February 5th, Mr. Merz, 64, paints himself as an outsider, having been pushed out of the position of the party whip in 2002 and leaving politics to make a personal fortune as the head of BlackRock Germany. Gender pronouns can be tricky on campus. Harvard is making them stick. Despite its reputation as a bastion of that establishment, the Kennedy School followed the students' lead, agreeing to provide clear plastic stickers this semester with 4 pronoun options that students could apply to their name cards: he, him, she, her, they, them, and ze, her. Skylar L. Spear, a first-year law student at the New York University who is transgender and non-binary, said the ability to enter pronouns when registering for classes will remove some of the obstacles that students face. Some colleges suggest that professors introduce themselves by their pronouns on the first day of class as a kind of bonding exercise and an implicit invitation for students to volunteer their own pronouns. At stake in Boy Scouts bankruptcy, $1 billion in assets, or much more. The sprawling facility, set to open later this year, is owned by the Boy Scouts, but not by the Boy Scouts of America, the national governing body that filed for bankruptcy protection on Tuesday, as the Boy Scouts of America tries to hammer out in bankruptcy court what it did not achieve outside it, a global settlement for a mountain of lawsuits over allegations of sexual abuse. The future of the scouting movement may turn on that distinction of ownership. The Boy Scouts of America has assets exceeding $1 billion. Its most recent tax filings show much of that in the form of financial investments like stocks and bonds, cash in the bank, property, including the vast Philmont Scout Ranch in New Mexico. Why this inmate chose the electric chair over lethal injection. Nicholas Sutton, like other death row inmates in Tennessee, has a choice in how the state will end his life. Dr. Zivo, who has evaluated Mr. Sutton along with other inmates on Tennessee's death row, said the inmates are often in poor health with a litany of medical problems, including diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, and pulmonary ailments. Nearly 4 decades had passed without an inmate being put to death in Tennessee when the state lawmakers in 1998 added lethal injection as a method of execution. Trump names Richard Grenell as acting head of intelligence. President Trump was expected to name Richard Grenell, the American ambassador to Germany, to be the acting director of national intelligence. 3 people familiar with the matter said on Wednesday. Mr. Trump quickly dropped those plans after pushback from Democrats and some key Republicans who worried Mr. Ratcliffe's loyalty to the president and lack of intelligence experience would make him nearly impossible to confirm. At the beginning of the Trump administration, Mike Pompeo, then CIA director, was the most prominent voice on intelligence matters. Rapper Pop Smoke is dead after Los Angeles home invasion, label says. Pop Smoke, a Brooklyn-based rapper who rose to fame with hit songs like Door and Welcome to the Party, was killed early Wednesday morning in Los Angeles, his record label said in what police described as a home invasion. A gravel-voiced rapper with a bark-like delivery, he quickly honed a signature approach that recalled the rougher New York rap of the 1990s. Pop Smoke is one of several notable rappers who have died in the last couple years. Millions of Americans have moved off assistance. Does Trump get credit? For now, the evidence support Mr. Trump's contention that an improving economy is more responsible for falling food stamp rolls than Mr. Trump's attempts to limit access. The decline in poverty levels since the end of the Great Recession has been the single largest factor in recent SNAP participation declines, said Dottie Rosenbaum, a researcher at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, a liberal research organization in Washington. Mr. Trump has also taken credit for the declines in number of Americans taking benefits from programs his administration collectively called welfare, including Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, and temporary assistance for needy families, which provide health coverage and cash assistance to low-income families. E. Jean Carroll says Elle magazine fired her after Trump rape allegations. E. Jean Carroll, the longtime Elle magazine advice columnist, who last year accused Donald J. Trump of raping her before he was elected president, said on Tuesday she was fired by the publication because Mr. Trump's repeated insults against her. Ms. Carroll sued Mr. Trump for defamation in New York State Court in November, saying that Mr. Trump had damaged her reputation and her career when he denied her allegation last June and called her a liar. In a letter to Mr. Trump's lawyers last month, Ms. Carroll said that she believed Mr. Trump's DNA could match genetic material found on the dress she says she was wearing the day of the alleged attack and has kept ever since. White House denies claim that Trump offered pardon deal to Julian Assange. Mr. Assange's legal team told court in London on Wednesday that Mr. Trump had made the offer in 2017 through Dana Rohrabacher, who at the time was a Republican congressman from California, which came the day after Mr. Trump pardoned numerous high-profile white-collar criminals, grabbed attention because a lawyer for Mr. Assange portrayed Mr. Dana Rohrabacher, portrayed Mr. Rohrabacher as acting on Mr. Trump's instructions. On Wednesday, a lawyer for Mr. Assange, Edward Fitzgerald, referred to in court to a statement by another lawyer for Mr. Assange, Jennifer Robinson, describing a purported quid-pro-quo offer conveyed by Mr. Rohrabacher, according to a Daily Beast account of a hearing on what evidence could be admitted at an upcoming extradition hearing. When Democrats vote, Trump is never far away. Mr. Trump began the day on Wednesday by voicing those complaints at a volunteer event attended by his son, Donald Trump Jr., and his son's girlfriend, Kimberly Guilfoyle, in a restaurant of the Trump International Hotel, Las Vegas. In a restaurant of the Trump International Hotel, Las Vegas. In his remarks to supporters and later on Twitter, Mr. Trump was reacting to several recently released polls, including one by NBC, the Wall Street Journal, and the Wall Street Journal, that showed him trailing several possible Democratic opponents, including Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, at 3 back-to-back rallies in Phoenix, Colorado Springs, and Las Vegas. Mr. Trump will also have the chance to connect with his base, with the added benefit that the rally in Arizona will take place Wednesday night in the middle of a Democratic debate. Judge in Roger Stone trial confronts a high-pressure decision, largely because related cases are generally assigned to the same judge. Judge Jackson, 65, has overseen most of the cases from the special counsel's investigation of Russian interference in the 2016 election. Just last week, Mr. Trump sent ripples of concern throughout the ranks of federal judges by attacking Judge Jackson on Twitter. Judge Beryl A. Howell, the Chief Justice of the Federal District Court in Washington, declared in a statement that public criticism of pressure did not affect the sentencing decisions of the judges of this court. Judge excuses 9/11 defense lawyer and postpones torture testimony. Colonel Cohen said that Mr. Harrington no longer had to travel to proceedings before the war court to defend his client, Ramzi bin al-Shibh, but that Mr. Harrington would have to continue overseeing court filings by a team of 7 more junior lawyers until the Pentagon hires a new lawyer with expertise in capital punishment cases. At one point, Colonel Cohen suggested that it could take a year to get a successor to Mr. Harrington prepared for the capital defense trial, and said that he originally thought to start the trial in June 2021. No qualified lawyers waiting in the wings, and the general in charge of the defense teams has 45 days to find one or seek an extension. In a particularly testy portion of the Wednesday's hearing, the judge acknowledged in open court he had secretly allowed prosecutors to establish a live computer link between the maximum security courtroom and several intelligence agencies, including the CIA and the FBI. The connection allows the agencies to monitor what is said in court as it happens, not on the 40-second delay that the public hears, and alert the prosecution to ask the judge to mute the audio to avoid potential disclosure of classified information. John Rood, a top defense official, latest to be ousted after impeachment saga. John C. Rood, the Defense Department's top policy official, is the latest member of President Trump's national security team to involved in the Ukraine matter to leave the government. Mr. Rood, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, will step down at the end of February, the department's press secretary, Elisa Farah, said Wednesday. Mr. Rood's departure, reported earlier by CNN, was not entirely unexpected. He and Defense Secretary Mark T. Esper were known to clash frequently early in their careers, and Mr. Esper was expected to fire him when he became Defense Secretary last year. Fact-checking the Las Vegas Democratic debate. In 2001, Mr. Bloomberg dismissed the book of quotes as Borscht Belt jokes. He never explicitly admitted to having said the quotes in the book. Last year, a Bloomberg spokesman, Stu Loser, issued a general comment about Mr. Bloomberg's history of misogynist comments, saying, Mike has come to see some of what he said is disrespectful and wrong. He believes his words will not always aligned with his values and the way he has led his life. Asked to explain the origins of the crisis in an appearance at Georgetown University, Mr. Bloomberg linked it to a federal interference in the mortgage lending business and a wide variety of other factors like very cheap money in the form of low Federal Reserve interest rates, a failure by banks to consider that home prices could fall, and developers that built more houses than the market could absorb. Nevada's Democrats' goals: turn on iPads, then run smooth caucuses. On page 31 of the Nevada Democratic Party's caucus manual, there are step-by-step instructions for precinct leaders on how to begin entering and tabulating caucus results. Throughout the caucuses, precinct leaders will be responsible for recording anywhere between 102 and 138 data points into the iPad, onto the state party's caucus math poster, which is to be posted on a wall of the precinct room, and the caucus reporting sheet, which is to be submitted as the official result. 5 cybersecurity experts contacted by the New York Times said they believe that, like the state Democratic Party in Iowa, Nevada officials waited too long to build a system to tally and transmit caucus results. Pete Buttigieg hoped to win over voters of color. It still hasn't happened. Paul Trott, a Buttigieg supporter and donor in Las Vegas, said, I'm realistic. I'm not optimistic. He predicted a 3rd or 4th place finish in Nevada for Mr. Buttigieg. Attendees mentioned Mr. Buttigieg's lack of experience as a 38-year-old former mayor of a small city, as well as new accounts of opposition he faced by some black residents of South Bend. In Nevada, Mr. Buttigieg's message and strategy are similar to what worked for him in Iowa. Organize and travel widely, especially in areas where Democrats don't often compete. His tone, his believability factor, are just a lot stronger than most other candidates, said James Soule, a Republican whose wife lured him away from work to Mr. Buttigieg's rally in Carson City. The night before, Bob Swiatek, a Republican who is a retired law enforcement officer, said he could vote for Mr. Buttigieg as the Democratic nominee. Inside the push to turn out Latino voters in Nevada, recent polls have shown Mr. Sanders attracting significant Latino support in the state, including a Univision poll that found that 1/3 of Latino Democrats who were registered to vote backed him. The Latino Vote Project, a turnout analysis conducted by the polling firm Latino Decisions and other groups, found last year that Latinos had been crucial to turning elections in 4 states, Arizona, Florida, Nevada, and Texas, that were competitive for Democrats in the 2018 midterms. Make the Road came to Ruth Mantia's door 11 months ago as a part of the group's effort to contact so-called low-propensity voters, or people who are considered unlikely to vote. When did Bloomberg turn against stop and frisk? When he ran for president. As the ongoing federal court case is now demonstrating for any objective observer to see, the NYPD conducts stops based on seeing something suspicious or witnesses' descriptions of suspects, not on any preconceived notions or on demographic data that would have you stopping old women as often as you stop young men. Almost all murders are young minority males killing young minority males. It's like 90%. Take out domestic violence. After that, there's nothing left. So you go to those places where the crimes are reported. You look for people that look like the description. And then you use good police work. Is there any reason to stop them? The courts say if you act furtively, or if there's a bulge in their pocket or something like that, you can stop them. And what happens is the kids learn. I don't want to carry a gun. We were overzealous at the time to do it. Our intent was to do anything we could to stop the carnage, the murder rate. What was surprising is that when we stopped doing a little bit, we thought crime would go up. It didn't. It went down. Should have, would have, and could have. Looking back, I can't help that. And looking back, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I apologize. When Donald Trump is the law. I'm actually, I guess, the chief law enforcement officer of the country, President Trump said on Tuesday. President Trump, abetted by supine Republicans in Congress, is now undermining the fair application of justice, as Nixon did, in similar and, in some cases, more egregious ways. Mr. Trump has claimed that the Constitution gives him the right to do whatever I want. His lawyers have argued in a federal case involving his tax returns that a sitting president cannot ever be investigated. All this dystopia, and for what? The technology, facial recognition, digital ad tracking, spyware, you name it, is being rapidly deployed by companies that aren't considering the potential societal harm. Clearview AI, the facial recognition company that scrapes billions of images from websites and social media platforms, claimed 100% accuracy when pitching its product to a police department and suggested it employed testing methodology used by the American Civil Liberties Union. The ACLU vehemently disagreed, telling BuzzFeed News that Clearview's accuracy claim is absurd on many levels, and further demonstrates that Clearview simply does not understand the harm of its technology in law enforcement hands. As law enforcement ponder facial recognition bans and comprehensive privacy laws, they'll do well to consider this fundamental question, setting aside even the ethical concerns. Are the technologies that are slowly eroding our ability to live a private life actually delivering on their promises? Companies like NEC and others argue that outright bans on technology like facial recognition stifle innovation. Though I am personally not convinced, there may be kernels to truth to that. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps? Go ahead, try it. Americans drop out of the labor force primarily because we do worse than other countries of investing in workers' education, healthcare, addiction treatment, and job training. Yes, some Americans soar from humble beginnings. More often, the top is occupied by those who say we're earning $200,000 a year at age 3 in today's money, as President Trump was. American children need fewer wagging fingers or homilies about bootstraps and more helping hands. Bloomberg's debate downer, leaving us with Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, and Michael Bloomberg, the new kid on the block. Blago's back. As the Democrats debate, Rod Blagojevich is setting up some new post-prison digs. All that silly business about having attempted to sell a Senate seat while he was a governor, completely forgotten. Bloomberg's top campaign strategist has been hinting sort of broadly that Biden, Buttigieg, and Klobuchar ought to drop out of the race so Bloomberg can unite the non-left part of the party against Bernie Sanders. Vitamin K for newborns is a no-brainer. Why are so many parents worried? Hemorrhagic disease of the newborn was widely recognized but poorly understood phenomena until the mid-20th century, when doctors demonstrated that such bleeding, now termed vitamin K deficiency bleeding, could be prevented by giving newborns a single dose of vitamin K. Since the early 1960s, it has been standard of care for newborns to receive an intramuscular injection of vitamin K shortly after delivery. The risk of high-dose intravenous vitamin K used to reverse life-threatening vitamin K deficiency bleeding in an infant are exponentially higher than the minor risk of a single intramuscular dose. In my own practice, I've learned a lot from asking parents a simple question. How do you think you might feel if you decline vitamin K and your baby develops serious bleeding? While the question gives some parents pause, I've been struck by the number of families who reply firmly but clearly that while they do not wish to see their baby suffer, they would not regret their decision to forego vitamin K. The seeds of mistrust, along with skepticism of science and intellectualism, that allure of the natural, and the development of social media-fueled communities founded on these values, run deep, and they're threatening the health of our youngest and most vulnerable. Seeing Black history in context. Black History Month is traditionally a time to honor Black Americans and theoretically accord them their proper place in American history. Perhaps it's because Black people don't want to ruin the Black History Month party, and white people would rather not examine their role in the racism that has made the month necessary in the first place. If we as a country don't significantly change our views of our own history, which is framed in Black history, there will be precious little in the future to celebrate. Trump's interventions in the justice system. In my eyes, President Trump's commutation of the sentence of Rod Blagojevich, former governor of Illinois, is the last straw in a long line of abhorrent transgressions. As someone who has received clemency and advocated for others who have been convicted of nonviolent drug charges, I support President Trump's use of his pardon's power. After publicly attempting to disempower the FBI and the State Department, President Trump has turned his attention to the justice system. From Rep. Nita Lowey, Trump versus NPR. In every budget request since he took office, President Trump has sought to eliminate federal funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Maybe that's why the president is so eager to bring the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to its knees. Online booksellers like social media companies are curating a public community platform where users may also rate and review the product. Vape shops face a choice: close or rebrand. Facing with growing fear about the risk of vaping, New Jersey last month became the second state to adopt legislation outlawing all nicotine vaping liquids other than those flavored to taste like tobacco. Vape shop owners argued that limiting sales in stores where customers already must be 21 years old will not significantly curb teen vaping, especially since flavored products remain readily available online. The Democratic governor vetoed a related bill that would have raised the fine for selling vaping or tobacco products to people younger than 21, require age verification scanners at stores, and cap the legal concentration of nicotine in vaping liquids sold in New Jersey at 2%. Weinstein jurors focus on Project Runway assistant's complaint. The jury in Harvey Weinstein's rape trial began its second day of deliberations by asking to review testimony and other evidence related to a former production assistant on Project Runway, who claimed that the producer had forced oral sex on her in 2006. The jury sent a note to the judge at 9:50 a.m. on Wednesday, requesting to hear all of the testimony from the production assistant, Miriam Haley. Mr. Weinstein's lawyers suggested that Ms. Haley and Mr. Weinstein had a consensual relationship. Though 6 women testified at the trial, the criminal charges hinge on allegations made by Ms. Haley and Jessica Mann, 34, who testified that Mr. Weinstein raped her at the DoubleTree Hotel in Midtown Manhattan in 2013. In deciding the predatory sexual assault charges, the jury is also being asked to consider the testimony of Annabella Sciorra, the actress known for her work on The Sopranos. Tessa Major's murder. Third teenager is arrested. A third teenager was arrested on Wednesday in the murder of Tessa Majors, an 18-year-old Barnard College student who was stabbed during a mugging in Morningside Park in northern Manhattan, 2 law enforcement officials said. The boy taken into custody is a 14-year-old middle school student, and he was expected to be charged with murder in the second degree and robbery, the official said. Last month, a third boy, who is 13, was arrested and charged as a juvenile with second-degree murder in family court. Pessimistic outlook in Russia slows investment and the economy. Despite last year's pledge to stimulus spending, a commitment that was reaffirmed this year when Mr. Putin outlined plans for new spending on such things as free school lunches, the government has continued socking away savings. In the boom years of the first 2 terms of Mr. Putin's long rule from 2000 to 2008, the economy expanded at an average pace of 7% per year. Since Russia embarked on a more assertive foreign policy in 2014, the economy has grown on an average of about 0.7% a year, including 2 recessionary years. Your doorbell camera spied on you. Now what? Last month, security researchers also found that Ring apps contained hidden code, which had shared customer data with third-party marketers. Ring has done precious little to address the broader threats to privacy and their devices enable, said William Buddington, a technologist for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a digital rights nonprofit group, who helped discover the trackers embedded inside Ring's apps. In response to how Ring's apps were using invisible trackers to send data to a third-party marketing and analytics firms, the company said it was temporarily pausing the use of most third-party analytics services in the Ring apps and website, while it worked on tools for people to opt out of this type of data sharing. China expels 3 Wall Street Journal reporters as media relations sour. China on Wednesday said it would revoke the press credentials of 3 Wall Street Journal reporters working in mainland China in a significant escalation of Beijing's pressure on the foreign news media. The Chinese authorities had objected to its headline, which read, "China is the real sick man of Asia." The move comes just months after Chinese officials effectively expelled another journal reporter, Chen Han Huang, from mainland China. MGM Resorts says data breach exposed some guests' personal information. MGM did not disclose the number of customers affected, but under the breach, a firm that monitors cybercrimes and provides intelligence about potential data breaches to companies said 10.6 million people were affected. Under the breach, said several high-profile guests at MGM properties had their email addresses, phone numbers, and physical addresses exposed, including one guest with the same name as Jack Dorsey, Twitter's chief executive. "Last summer, we discovered unauthorized access to a cloud server that contained a limited amount of information for certain previous guests at MGM Resorts," MGM Resorts International said in a statement. Airline flight delays got worse in 2019. Here's a scorecard. Airlines in the United States performed worse in 2019 than the year before in getting flights to destinations on time, while the share of flights canceled climbed for the 3rd straight year, the Transportation Department reported Wednesday. Overall, 79% of flights in 2019 arrived on time, slightly less than the year before, the department said. Frontier performed worse than any other, with just 73.1% of its flights reaching their destination by the time promised. Boeing to fend off sanctions backs ending state tax breaks. Moving to end a threat of international trade sanctions against Boeing, lawmakers in Washington state on Wednesday introduced legislation that would eliminate tax breaks for the plane maker. The United States and Boeing contend that Airbus received billions in so-called launch aid from European countries as it developed new aircraft, while European officials and Airbus responded that Boeing had received illegal subsidies from Washington state. American officials were bracing for retaliatory duties over the Boeing case, but doing away with the state tax breaks eliminates a target for European Union trade representatives. Fed flagged coronavirus risk at January meeting. Fed officials have signaled that they plan to leave possible policy unchanged as they wait to see how the economy shapes up in 2020. Since the January gathering, Fed officials have consistently signaled that they remain comfortable leaving rates unchanged for now, unless an economic surprise knocks them off that course. The Fed has just stopped shrinking its bond holdings, swollen by post-crisis stimulus programs, when rates in the obscure but important market for short-term lending between banks temporarily jumped. New York Times leads Polk Awards with 4 prizes. The award for political reporting was split between reporters at the Wichita Eagle, a Kansas newspaper owned by McClatchy, which declared bankruptcy this month, and the Baltimore Sun, a daily owned by Tribune Publishing, which recently disclosed that its largest shareholder is Alden Global Capital, a hedge fund with a reputation for cutting costs at newsrooms it owns. 3 reporters from Bloomberg News won the Financial Reporting Award for a series on how some investors exploited and profited from the Opportunity Zone codicil of the 2017 federal tax law, which was designed to benefit impoverished neighborhoods 4 reporters from the Seattle Times, one in the business reporting category for showing that the Federal Aviation Administration had approved the Boeing 737 MAX's flight control system, later found to be flawed after 2 fatal crashes and after its cooperation with Boeing's own inspectors. Yes, rich cities are getting richer, but that's not the whole story. The real concentration of economic activity that has happened in the metros ranked 11th to 50th. In 1980, those 40 metros took 26.9% of national income, and that grew to 29.9% in 2018. The smallest metros and rural areas, every place outside the 250 largest metros, saw their share of income shrink by a fifth to 14.6% from 18.3%. Why haven't the rising incomes of the so-called superstar cities translated to further domination of the economy by a few top metros? The answer, in short, the places getting richer aren't the places getting bigger. These constraints in rich places may also help spread the wealth by shifting growth to a wider set of more affordable places where a lower cost of living more than offsets lower salaries for most occupations. Europe, overrun by foreign tech giants, wants to grow its own. The European Union on Wednesday outlined an attempt to restore what officials call technological sovereignty, seeking tougher regulation of the world's biggest tech platforms, new rules for artificial intelligence, and more public spending for the European tech sector. Officials have said the effort is a generational project, and the ideas reflect a growing concern among European leaders that countries in the region are overly dependent on services provided by companies based elsewhere. We are presenting our ambition to share Europe's digital future, said Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, the executive branch of the European Union that is crafting the policy. And that has been Reading the Times for Thursday, February 20, 2020. It's 2020. That's interesting. Peace.